James Lovell may be best known as the commander of Apollo 13. During the April 1970 Apollo mission, the service module's cryogenic oxygen system failed whilst on the way to the moon, putting the astronauts' lives in danger. And for 4 tense days, he and his 2 crewmates, John Swigert, Fred Haise, along with the NASA ground controllers, worked to return their spacecraft back to the Earth. One of my all-time favourite stories is of Apollo 13. Who hasn't said at one point in their life, "Houston, we have a problem"? And when Mission Control Chief Gene Kranz says, "Gentlemen, failure is not an option," it just makes me go all tingly and proud of what the genius of those guys at NASA accomplished, creating filters for the carbon monoxide that was building up in the capsule, ensuring that they had enough power left in the batteries to get them back to Earth. They were many thousands of miles away from home, but with God's help in providing the essential items and the teamwork back on Earth, they managed to return home safely to their families unscathed. In Jim Lovell's book, he tells a very amazing story about the flight he was on while stationed on an aircraft carrier. He was flying a Banshee aircraft back to the Shangri-La aircraft carrier at night. The carrier was in darkness as they were in combat mode whilst in conflict with Korea. Some things never change. Jim's radar had jammed, and his homing signal to the carrier was inoperative, as someone was using the same frequency in Japan and inadvertently was blocking his signal. So he turned the light on in his cockpit of his plane so he could read the map. And as he did this, the whole lighting system failed, as did all his flying instruments. He was literally flying blind. It was almost dark, and hours before the moon would rise. He tried everything to get the instruments back working. And short of the modern-day method of Microsoft computer software engineers switching everything off and restarting the plane's jet engine, this wasn't an option. He was completely without hope. He managed to radio his flight officer back at the carrier, asking for his position relative to the carrier, so that he could at least be flying towards home instead of out to a Black Sea. Amazingly, he was dead on the stern of the ship. All he had to do was keep flying in a straight line, and he would get back to the ship. But how would he know he was flying in a straight line without instruments? Being an accomplished pilot, he flew as he'd been trained by sheer instinct. Then he began to worry about how he would land the plane once he'd got there. If he came in too low, he'd crash into the stern. If he came in too high, he'd overshoot the hook which catches and slows down the planes. If he did this, it wouldn't grab him, so he'd end up in the sea, right in front of the ship. And the ship is travelling at 30 to 40 knots. The chief officer told him not to borrow trouble and that they'd work out how to land him once he caught up with the ship. Several minutes went by. Then he lost radio contact. This guy by now had got the worst luck in the world. How could he ever land on an aircraft carrier in the dark with no lights, no instruments, and no radio? Jim Lovell said that about that time he saw the sea begin to glow like a ribbon of light. He instantly realised that this was the algae stirred up in the wake of the ship. All he had to do was follow this glow and he'd be home in no time, The closer he got to the ship, the brighter the sea got. And soon the froth churned up by the gigantic propellers was glowing almost as bright as the full moon. Bright enough that it was like landing lights on a runway. He could gauge the proper height that he was travelling and land safely onto the ship. Now, the thing about this was that if the lights hadn't failed in his cockpit, he would not have seen the bright glow in the sea. It might not have been his most graceful of landings, but I'm sure it was his most grateful landing. I'm sure that during all this trauma, Jim Lovell would have prayed to God at some point in all this. Jim Lovell did speak of God and his influence in his book, but he went wide of the mark when telling the story. He called himself lucky. I would say he was blessed and in the safe hands of God. Luck had nothing to do with it. God had a plan, and everything went according to his plan. In that string of mishaps, I can see God's fingerprints all over the chain of events and how God prepared him for that specific stage in his life. If Jim Lovell had not been taught in high school about the biology of algae, then he would not have known that he was looking at in the sea that night. If he had not been an experienced pilot, then he may have panicked and crashed the plane or flown out to sea. There is no such thing as coincidence or luck. Let's just call it the will of God. However, the fact remains that God makes provision for every circumstance. He leads us to school and guides us through it. When we fall, he picks us up, dusts us off, bandages our torn knees and puts ice on our black eyes. And he pushes us back to school so that we are all prepared to face our own black sea. And he gives us our own frothy glow to follow. As Christians, we constantly face uncertainties and fearful moments. But fear is not of the Lord. He gave us spirit of power and love and sound minds, not of fear. So we should all look for the glow and follow it. We must follow it together. God has put it there, especially for all of us, to remind us that he is always near and that nothing can snatch us from the safety of his hands. It says in the Bible, in 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 17, on the contrary, when he was in Rome, he searched hard for me until he found me. Remember, when in the dark, follow the glow of God, like Jim Lovell. May God bless you all. Amen.